and every lightning rod has gotta watch the storm cloud come down the sky. And I've heard of pious men.
I see the way it can have results educational wise, but I am very much aware of the terrible history in some ways of behaviorism as practiced. So
yeah, because I associate behaviorism with essentially a denial of internal life, that there is meaningful internal life, that all aspects of a human being are essentially denoted through their behavior, and that's why it's called
exactly behaviorism. Well, yeah, that's where you got through Skinner, and I mean, and you know, people will come back, behaviorists will come back and say, well, no, we're not saying exactly all that. But if you read Skinner, for example, who really was the founder of behaviorism, it really is a denial of free will, you know, and like you say, like the soul, or concepts of even innate structures that are mysterious. Like Chomsky was arguing, you know, Chomsky took him to task when Skinner wrote an article about how language is acquired just through operant conditioning. Chomsky was like, no, you know, he said, you know, there's this thing called, you know, innate structures of human beings. Like, there's no way that from the amount of data giving to a small child that they can come up with this incredible creativity, you know. So I'm aware of both sides, in fact, yeah. And I kind of side more towards the Chomskyan side, but I see a lot of results practically in educational purposes through the modified behaviorism, not like it was when Skinner was around practicing. This is kind of like a post-Chomskyan behaviorism, you know, but it still uses the idea of stimuli in response, which we all have, and we, you know, it's just part of mechanism, you know, I think, of the body, right? So like we all have like 2 eyes, 2 ears, a brain, you know, like there are certain principles and parameters that you can work with. The parameters change, but the principles pretty much stay the same, because we're all human beings, 99%, you know, close to 100.
Yeah, I wonder if that perspective can ever be totally liberating, of course, because it's a conceptual framework, isn't it? That you're fitting people into. So you'll never really touch the totality of a person. And I mean, a bit like the people who come into Jason's shop, that the resolution to their despair and their isolation, it might in a sense be outside a conceptual offering. That
right.
that you can feed them as many concepts as you want, and it will just turn into their constant dialogue. And the only way that they'll get out of that is by being offered an opportunity to be outside of a conceptual, or outside language, really, in a sense. That's the only way they'll get liberation and some kind of sense of return to balance and internal well-being.
Interesting. Yeah.
I'm speculating. I'm just offering that as a, you know, a counterpoint, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mentioned us being in our boxes at the start of this meet, and of course there's the Skinner box, the notorious, infamous Skinner box, which I think Whitley Strieber was victimized by. At least he believes that. And what Martin's talking about there is how concepts are kinds of boxes that we put meanings in. And the danger is because we don't ever open the box. We just think that because we've come up with a concept, we've encountered the thing that we're conceptualizing. So they can, like words themselves, they can be pointers to an experience or an understanding, but they can also point away from them insofar as we take the word for the thing that it's symbolizing. And the thing about autism that I was bringing up with you, Brandon, about how they don't take it into the body. If this is true, I got it from Joseph Pilton Pierce, and it's a model that I've worked with a lot, which doesn't mean it's true, but I found it useful, that I think it has to do with whether or not we internalize language at a bodily level, and that's what internalize means, doesn't it? Whether it goes into the body, and that's like taking on the matrix code or taking on the programming. It's like, and this relates to compartmentalization as well. I think like it's almost like at some level as consciousness, we construct, or we allow to have implanted these boxes within us, our consciousness, and then that becomes the way in which we interact with the world, is through that filter of compartmentalized conceptual consciousness. And somehow then that makes us unable to really interact with reality, because we're only interacting with the internal program then.
Yeah, I agree. But, there has to be some kind of framework, you know. And yeah, every framework is going to come with its limitations. And I agree with you. Like the brain, I think, is like a filtering system for the stimuli. Even the body can be looked at like as a filtering system for the incredible amounts of stimuli that we can't even see or or imagine. Well, we can imagine it, but yeah, it's I see what you're saying. In linguistics, we're thought of to think of language as like, almost like an organ. Almost as if it's a functioning. Yeah, it's a bodily organ. It's like it's almost that based in DNA and almost materialism, but where it comes from is mysterious, obviously, because there's no sense of physical sense.
Right. Well, that's
Newton, at least,
That's where I was wondering. That's where my mind was going. I was thinking Videodrome was the first thing that came to mind. The word made flesh in a dark way. There's also in Castaneda's thing about the foreign installation. Have you read any of Castaneda?
I've read a little bit. I had a friend who had all the Castaneda books, and I've recently gone back to them a little bit, but very sparingly. I know of them.
Yeah. I don't recommend them anymore. I mean, I wouldn't recommend them, but occasionally I find I have to, or I do refer to them, because there's something very novel in there, which again, like with Chilton Pearce, it seems to be, it's useful to as a model for looking at phenomena. And in this case, he writes about something called the foreign installation, that actually comes from off planet, and that infiltrates our nervous system via syntax, is how he puts it, but we could say via language. I mean, they're not synonymous, are they? But they're similar. So is syntax is what's embedded in language, is it?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, it's an underlying algorithm, let's just say. Yeah.
There you go, the underlying algorithm. Perfect. Even the word syntax is so archetypal, right? We're being taxed on our sins by some off-world entity that's possessed us and dissociated us from reality. And to bring it to the specifics, you say that you're appreciating about what I explore on these meetings, about how to articulate and how we articulate that. And back to this autistic thing, because many autistics are non-verbal, right? They don't internalize language, let's say, but some of them learn to imitate language. So basically they do it from the outside in rather than from the inside out. So you've got echolalia, they will just repeat phrases over and over. So what I think this speaks to, and I think you can see this in someone like Dave Oshana, who has had this enlightenment, has entered into this other state, or describes anyway, and seems to embody something that is beyond most of our experience, and that gets called enlightenment in the spiritual circles, is that when they use language, they say autists, or I think with Dave, they don't understand what they're saying.
Right.
In a certain sense, not in the sense that, I mean, maybe literally with some autists, they literally don't know what they're saying, they're just repeating phrases, right? That is the case with some autistics. But with Dave Oshana, and it's something I experience a little bit now, that it's possible to speak from the body, so it's without referring to any internal language set or to that whole system, which is where the syntax is operating, I suppose, of meaning. It's a body meaning, or it's a deeper meaning, and the words are articulating something, and they can be understood as words, but they're actually conveying a transmission that is not not restricted by the words. And so it's almost like I don't know what I'm saying right now, but I hear myself speaking and the body is articulating something, and yeah, I can play it back literally in record time, and I can recognize, oh, I've just said something and it made sense, but I'm actually speaking from a different level, potentially. I'm not claiming to be doing this now, but potentially that can happen. I'm speaking from I would think of it as the unconscious. Even the unconscious is articulating through the body, and it's becoming conscious as it's going through the mind and turning into words, and so then the mind is observing it. But what's expressing is pre-language, pre-verbal. Does that make sense?
With Dave, I think it's the continuity in his talking. The sort of thread of continuity is totally different, and I think that in any one sentence, his sentences are conforming to the rules of language, the rules of English, but it's the ongoing continuity as he's talking, where as a listener you are not falling into any sort of habitual or customary kind of association. So as he's talking, it's all sort of, yeah, that sentence makes sense, that sentence makes sense, I see he's talking, but as it goes along and along and along, it's sort of the impression is of this underlying continuity where all of this talking is coming from, that's not minded, as you say.
I mean, that's what I was trying to articulate today as well, is that like the logos is the idea in the beginning was the word, is the idea that reality itself is language, which Philip K. Dick, of course, was into. So everything is communicating consciousness. Everything is a communication of consciousness with itself, or with the physical realm. Or the physical realm itself is an expression of consciousness. Of course, now we're getting very mystical. I didn't mean to go there. To pull back a bit, the autism intense will syndrome, of course, familiar with, right? That autistic brains, like you said, they don't filter, so they're just experiencing reality in a way that's unfiltered and overwhelmed, and so then they can't articulate it or even navigate it. And so thinking in pictures is it seems to me that, and this is we all do when we dream, right? And I don't know if anyone else has this experience, but when I fall asleep, sometimes I fall asleep consciously and I experience my thoughts turning into images. And then that becomes the dream, of course. So we all know what that's like, even if we're not very conscious of it happening. And clearly that's closer to it. An image represents reality. An image of a tree is much closer to a tree than the word tree, So we're getting closer to a direct interface with reality, or an internalization of external reality, if we're thinking in pictures. But what about, and I've never had this thought before, what about somebody who thinks in smells?
Yeah.
Or thinks in sensations? Like, have you ever heard about that possibility?
I thought about it, but I know people who are on the spectrum that are definitely, I mean, I think it was Jacques Lacan that said, I think with my feet. But no, I get it. Like with smells, yeah, that makes sense. That's kind of a bad pun, but yeah. I mean, I can see that. I mean, I've had people, notice, that's an interesting that you point that out, because a lot of people on the spectrum you find have a heightened sensitivity to smells, in fact, maybe because it arouses the visual image that helps them process social life, Right. It's interesting. Very interesting.
Very interesting. And then that's where I was going with it, was synesthesia. What if you were thinking synesthetically?
Wow.
So that would be intense will syndrome. No? Your consciousness would just be everything that's happening. But it would still be a language. just a language that would be so complex and multifaceted that you couldn't ever reduce it to words.
Yeah, the ineffable, I guess. The mysterium tremendum of the universe. But like you said, like the logos. But I think the logos is sort of like, it's almost like a mathematical code in a way. Maybe it is the algorithm, but we're told that the logos was made flesh, and that's a whole nother topic. But that's a fascinating way to look at it. That's why I learn a lot from just listening to you, Jason, and everybody here. You're very, very smart people. Brilliant.
Well, the mathematical logos is ratio, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
It's the symbol of the ratio. So it's what determines the relationship between things.
Okay.
Something like that.
Right.
So like Christ is the ratio between God and man.
Right.
And that's the mathematical formula that the Word became flesh, God incarnated as man.
Right.
But, I mean, if it's mathematical, it's pretty simple.
Interesting, yeah.
It's pretty simple, but it's the mathematical formula of 1 equals infinity.
Right.
Which is like what it would be like if you were a synesthetic thinker, if you were enlightened. One could imagine, one has to imagine. And then again, if that's what reality is and we're just filtering it out, when we don't have to imagine, we just have to notice it. See what I mean? Like we are perceiving this all the time, but then we just crunch it down and then we just retain awareness of just the version that our minds tell us that this is what we're experiencing.
I had a thought about what you were saying about the ratio, and that I was thinking that enlightenment represents the embodiment of that ratio, the ratio of logos. You're no longer subordinated by the ratio between God and man. That you essentially internalize the ratio yourself and are no longer underneath it. And that is what enlightenment is.
Right. You become the ratio rather than being on one side of it.
Yeah. Yeah. So you're neither above it or below it. You are at it. You're at the interface between the infinite and the unitary, I suppose.
Which is represented by crucifixion also. Because that's the intersection between the two poles.
No, right.
Where's Charles Upton when you need him?
Yeah, well, he'd certainly have a lot to say, but he might balk at a certain point. I don't know. Be interesting to see a conversation between him and Dave.
Yeah, that would be interesting.
Yeah, because Dave is.
Dave would start talking about where his dog likes to take a shit.
Yeah, or his own bowel movements.
Yeah.
And, well, I mean, isn't it that thing that if you become, I don't know, I don't want to put it in the wrong way, but I mean, if you become the ratio, you can't see the ratio anymore. So, like Dave said something recently, which was that he used to pray, but he can't pray anymore because, I don't want to paraphrase now, but it was almost like there's no one to pray to. But what he seemed to be saying was, I'm that would pray, that I would pray to is, I can't separate myself from what I would pray to.
Yeah, yeah, he doesn't see himself as distinct. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think what he said was I'm the only one here, or something like that. There's only me here. which of course could come out the wrong way if you said it to the wrong people and in the wrong context.
Yeah, what he means is his sense of God is within himself, that it's not something he doesn't perceive himself as distinct from it.
Yeah. And this isn't, I mean, Charles Upton does acknowledge this. He has a humility there. And one has to, I mean, this is what I was trying to express on the earlier meet, that the dogma of theology and traditional metaphysics is a true dogma, but it, like I said about scientific method, it sort of cancels itself out, because the dogma itself says thou art that God resides within you and that you will know God when you know that you are God. It doesn't really say that, because then it becomes heresy, but essentially it's there in the theology. It is there. It's there in the incarnation. Christ says, you are in me and I'm in you. So that it thereby invalidates itself in a weird way, because it's saying that you can only come to God via knowing yourself, not by scripture or dogma or anything like that. So it was interesting talking to Charles, because he does acknowledge that, but for him, he needs Orthodox religion. That's been his way, and so he recommends it to others. And I was tempted for a time, like maybe that's my way. And if I hadn't known Dave, maybe I would have gone there. But it's like knowing Dave, I'm like, well, I don't know. It just opens up a different vista. And I think I've always been one who had to find my own way without adhering to dogma. But I was also very against dogma, and I'm beginning to see that dogma actually does have its function as well. Maybe like you were saying, Brandon, about you do need some structure, as long as you don't mistake the structure for what it's allowing you to build.
Right. Or direct experience.
Yeah.
Because I think, there's a danger in thinking that, I mean, it's great, that feeling and direct experience of the absolute, of the of non-existence, of at oneness with everything in the world and the cosmic and God and Jesus and their logos, and everything like that. That's all well and good, but where do you go from there? In some ways, it's like, in some ways, it reduces things to flatland, where it's like you said, like he has no one to pray to now, and it's like, well, I don't know. The feeling I get is that, even though I'm part of the universe, and that the universe, I am the universe speaking through itself, and all that stuff, and all the paradoxes, and that there is a universe, there is something like this thing has gone on greater than me. There is something greater than me going on. And that I have to, by willingly submitting and humbling myself to that, I can be a better conduit for that truth, in some ways. I don't think, I think that is a message of esoteric Christianity. One of them is that you are God too, and you are also the Christ. But another message is you're also not, we're not perfect. We, a lot of the things, lessons in the Bible and Christ it's pretty unattainable. Some of the things that are up in there. At least, I mean, if you can attain a state of grace 24/7 without falling into sin, then you're a much better person than me. But I think we all, if we are honest with ourselves, we all, do fall back into that. And I don't know. For me, it's like once you become your own God, where do you go from there? You know what I mean? I mean, you know, and then, you know, if that's the ideal place to get people to, I mean, we saw this with, that's basically Hinduism. You know, when you become your own God, you know, and everybody's God, it's kind of reminds me of pantheism. And I understand it, but I think that the Bible is making a different claim in a way. The story of Christ is, or John, in John at least, is that the Logos became flesh. This infinite being out of love became a finite thing, and to redeem those finite things. So it's as if you had like an ant farm and you said, oh, I'm going to become one of those little ants and take part of its suffering to redeem those ants. And but it's not even that, because that would be the distance between a finite thing and a finite thing is smaller than the distance between an infinite thing and a finite thing. I don't know. It's a very complex issue, but it's a good one.
What I'm wondering is, because I understand the need for a structure in terms of a theology, as I said, for a dogma, but I don't understand the need for a structure in terms of organized religion. Like I can't see any good in organized religion, because I think once it becomes institutionalized, or as it becomes institutionalized, it becomes the opposite of what it's supposedly organizing around. And I think that even creeps into the dogma. So what's coming to my mind is, whatever's driving these soldiers of Christ, they're clearly driven to attain worldly power. So that's flag number one. And like I was listening to Whitley Strieber the other day, which I never do anymore, but somebody sent me a audio, so oh, what the fuck, I'll see what Whitley's up to these days. And it was all pretty much the same stuff, but he did say something that was more overt than maybe I'd heard him say it before, because he was describing all these experiences. I don't know how familiar you are with Whitley, but most people here are a little bit. And he acknowledged, because they're so horrifying, the experiences he has, but they're also correspondingly amazing and transcendental,
Right.
experience, bliss and enlightenment and all this, but it's all juxtaposed with these horrible torments. And he acknowledges them. He said, yes, the visitors, the way they work with me, it's all reward and punishment based. And then he said, well, that's probably because I'm like that. But anyway, I thought, well, okay, he's really said it there, because, you know, and he's a Catholic, right? So
Is he really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, he's a Catholic, and not even an ex-Catholic. He's still Catholic. And being a Catholic means you believe in hell. And there can be no greater motivating force than the belief in hell. So, and I think that's an example of a dogma that has come out of an organization, because there's a pathology, a pathologos, that's actually running that, the consciousness of that organization. And so the idea of hell, which is initially an esoteric metaphor for something, becomes more and more concretized. And the more real it comes to be, the more of a driving force it becomes, the more pathological the people who are possessed by that belief will become. So I don't know how you feel about that, or how you feel about hell.
I feel the same way. Yeah, no, I agree. And I think that even like the concept of hell, if you go back and look at it, like, yeah, you're right, it's an esoteric metaphor on one level. If you take the Bible to be literally true, then it's more than just a metaphor. But the way I look at hell, it's like, you know, you have Dante Alighieri, who basically created the imagination and the whole concept of hell and purgatory, basically, you know, and mapped it out even, you know. And there's a lot of alchemical, interesting truths in there, and it's more of like a literary work, right? But then what you say, like, that becomes part of the imagination, like a meme almost infecting maybe the clergy, and they say, well, yeah, we can use this, you know, we can use these images of damnation and hell and stuff like that, and it will really work to our ends. That's very evil, you know, that's very evil, I think.
And they would be possessed by it themselves.
Mm-hmm.
It's like they're spreading a virus that they've let possess their own consciousness. And it's a split. It's actually a split. This is why, I mean, in a sense, that inoculated me from organized religion or from religious doctrine, dogma, from taking it too much on board, even though, because I had a felt sense of the truth of Christ, is that the idea of hell, and you say, if the Bible's literally true, then hell is literally real, but I don't think there's anything in the Bible that says hell exists and you will go there for all eternity if you're a sinner. I'm pretty sure it doesn't spell it out at any point.
But well, okay.
Yeah, so there's wiggle room there, right? There's lots of wiggle room because it's poetic. So poetry always has a metaphorical element because it's using imagery, right? But anyway, insofar as I was always aware that the idea of hell as an eternal place of damnation that God sends sinners to inherently invalidates the idea of God and of Christ. God is all merciful and Christ is all redeeming. That basically limits their power. And so it's inherently contradictory is my point. I don't want to get into the theology. And that inherent contradiction, like many, but more than most, because it's so profound, I think it creates a split. It's the doublethink, isn't it? Religious doublethink. You've got to believe in an all-forgiving God and an eternal hellfire if you don't serve the will of your all-forgiving God. Then you're split. And I think that's a very central tool for social engineering and whatnot. But that's a symptomatic of itself of trauma, and that somehow how and why the organized traumatization of children has become central to the maintenance of the memeplex and the psychosocial control of religion. Because it's children whose psyches have been traumatized, like Whitley, they've already been colonized by the pathologos. They've internalized that split from the start, so then they will naturally gravitate towards a mythical kind of framework that matches that trauma.
Kind of like a bicameral mind, almost like the bicameral mind. If you take that Julian Jaynes hypothesis that there was a cataclysm, which a trauma on a worldwide scale, that basically that our minds are, two different hemispheres are divided at first. So it would be very easy then that the corpus callosum or the two hemispheres being united. It's very easy if a traumatic event comes along then to insist on a rigid, like you say, like duality almost, right? Do I get that right?
Well, that's part of it, yeah. But also when you're using that model, then you can, as a controlling agency or group, a priestcraft and what have you, that's engineering the trauma and the split, you can insert yourself in that corpus callosum, figuratively and maybe literally, and become the voice of God. Because if you split people off from a direct experience of their own intuitive sense of God, that they are God, they are an instrument of God, then they have to refer to the other part of their brain. Then you can start using the implants and beaming, I'm talking figuratively, but it's become literal, beaming, electromagnetic voices into their head, and they'll think it's God.
Right. Wow. That's brilliant. Wow.
That's why I find it quite interesting when you said, Brandon, that you didn't find the idea of being unified with God appealing, or that concept of enlightenment wasn't appealing to you because it dissolved that structure. And I find that's
it's appealing. I wouldn't say it's not appealing. It is appealing. I mean, who wouldn't want to be God or be with God or anything like that? I just think I don't think it's the whole story, and I don't think it's a state that. I mean, maybe it is that you're supposed to be 24/7. I think, but maybe it could be a defect of, like you're saying, like my own programming for my lifetime or whatever. But I just think that there is God and there is you. And I understand, like, you can take part in subcreation, but there ultimately is one creator. But whatever, maybe I'm wrong. I could be wrong.
But it
Yeah,
seems,
you're right. No, I think it is appealing.
it seems to me that structure is necessitated by the church. That division, the division between God and man, is an imperative that comes from the church, because it's the church that inserts itself in that stratigraphy, if that's the right word. So it's outside of the church that distinction dissolves. And so what I feel about an organization like Opus Dei is that they say they're soldiers of Christ, but really they're soldiers of the church.
That's a good point.
And in the way that the CIA will define itself, at least during the Cold War, define itself as fighting communism, that it was on that they were fighting on an ideological basis, but the reality of their operational methods was totally divorced from ideology, really.
Oh yeah, that's for sure. Yeah.
It was about objectives, achieving objectives.
Right.
Yeah. So sorry, Murray.
I was just thinking that going back to what Dave said, that he could no longer pray because he didn't recognize the difference or distinguish a difference between him and God, made me think that, like the Advaita trap, that you can go around saying, well, it's all God, I don't need to change because it's just God, which kind of negates the material, saying that there's only the immaterial, there's only the absolute, which is clearly not true, because there is the human being as well. So sort of, I just thought maybe it's the only the ego that can pray, because God doesn't need to. The true self wouldn't have any. And as well as saying that, the other side I was thinking is that, isn't God quite, supposed to be far away and come sort of like animate here, so that although we can be the absolute and embody the absolute and certainly experience the absolute, there's still, like Brendan said, there's still something higher, because it's sort of like sunlight reaching us rather than the source. The source would still be higher. That made any sense?
Well, you're asking questions. I'm not going to say the right ones because this isn't theology class, but
did the question make sense?
Yeah, it did. I think you're underscoring the tension or potential contradiction, but maybe also the paradox in theological doctrine and dogma. And I think, again, to me, the value of dogma is that it negates itself. Because if you really go into an understanding of dogma, Christian dogma in this case, you will find, well, on the way, you'll find incredibly useful mathematical equations, if you like Girard writes about, for understanding society and human behavior and all that, incredibly profound, like game-changing stuff. But you'll also find the way out of that, and the way out of that somehow is in letting the dogma negate and cancel itself out, and seeing that existence is inherently paradoxical. Like the infinite being incarnated or God being a man is inherently paradoxical, and that's throughout all of many of the tenets of Christianity, including this one that was going back and forth now, which is God omnipresent or is he far away? Well, he's both, because he's infinite, therefore he's as far away from us finite mortals as we can't even imagine what he is. But he's infinite, so therefore he's here where we are too, because he's everywhere. So that means we can't not be God. But somehow we can have an experience of ourselves as not God. And that seems to be what the incarnation is about, is God volunteering to have an experience of himself as not God. And what you were saying, Brandon, was in that, we're not Christ because we're not perfect. Well, Christ wasn't perfect either. Christ even says that, or at least he says, "Don't call me good, because only the Father is good." And I mean, my understanding of Christ, and I think this has maybe got lost in the shuffle too because of the institutions and whatnot, is that Christ only became God, or God only realized himself as God via the crucifixion and the resurrection.
Mm-hmm.
The rest of his life, he was fumbling around trying to figure out what to do. And he was praying. He did pray to God, save me from the mission that you gave me. So we can certainly emulate that. And the figurative crucifixion, whatever that is, surrender, complete surrender to reality. It's the metaphor of the story, which I happen to think was literally historically true also, although I don't know, is that it's hardest of all to surrender under the worst conditions. Although in a certain sense it's also easiest because you've got no choice. But to really surrender as Christ did and say, "This is thy will, therefore it's good." That's in Job as well. We can do that on a daily basis. Every time something goes wrong, we just accept it and let go of our ego. Then the distance between us and God is annihilated. So I think, and what Martin was referring to, and you did acknowledge it, Brandon, so I don't want to over dwell on this, but initially you denied it, that you weren't saying it, but what the enlightenment wasn't for you. But what you said was it would be like a flat land, like a
Godhead, yeah.
Well, you didn't use the word Godhead, but just anyway.
Or enlightenment, yeah.
If you became one with God, and that was all there was, it would be this flat land. And then, interesting, you went to pantheism with Hindu, and I think that's again when we try to use our mind to wrestle the paradox. Like if God was incarnate in all of us and we were all Christ, there'd be lots of little gods running around. So then you have a pantheon, but well, it's a bit too soon to imagine what that would be like, really, isn't it? But it seems to me that anyway, that another way of looking at it is just that God is infinite, so God can express himself through innumerable number of incarnations, even simultaneously. So what if there's one Christ, why not many? It doesn't diminish the greatness of Christ. And yes, of course, the ego can get hold of that and say, I'm going to be my own God, and that's the serpent's temptation. So there is that. There is the counterfeit. But it seems as though the soldiers of Christ that are manifest on this earth and seeking worldly power, they're the ones who've taken the serpent's temptation and saying we can be as gods, while telling the rest of us, no, you can't be as gods. You can't be like Christ. Unless they're ready to pass the initiation and, commit the sin against the Holy Spirit, whatever it is, and then they can become as gods. So I think you're in a double bind. Not that we aren't, all of us, but like you're kind of on a macro or a visible thing. Like you're drawn towards the truth of the gospel and the recognition that there is a dogma that's true. Have you read Girard, by the way?
No.
Okay. Well, I'd recommend Girard because he makes Christianity practical and social and psychologically meaningful, while at the same time he doesn't strip it. He's not reducing it. He doesn't strip it of the sacred element. He maps how the truth can be embedded in language, so in the gospel itself, in the words of Christ. But anyway, it was a bit of a digression. But the double bind, which Girard writes about too, of seeking the truth and then seeking it in dogma and then ending up in the organizations and the institutions that have used the dogma to attain worldly power. You end up through Chapel Perilous or through the Looking Glass, and we end up in the matrix, in the simulacra, which is the counterfeit, as the kingdom of Satan, essentially. And that's in the gospel too. Like, the Opus Dei probably know that they're serving Satan, it's my guess, but they rationalize it because somebody's got to do it. I mean, I'm really going off on a limb now. Shouldn't be saying this about your church, but
No,
that's what I found out about Crowley, let's say. And there is something about when something becomes worldly or becomes oriented towards worldly power, even or especially if it's in the name of God, it falls from grace.
Right. I agree. But look at any church out there, okay? Orthodox, Greek Orthodox Church, Russian Orthodox Church, Christianity. If Christianity is going to be my path, then what's it going to be? You know? I mean, I'm not going to be Greek Orthodox Christianity, because why? I mean, even though there's a lot of beautiful parts about it, still has the abuse. It still has all the problems, the double bind problem that you're talking about. You want to talk about power and worldly power. Every single church is out there is grabbing for worldly power in a way. Like you said, like maybe that's an inherent flaw in institutional religion, that that's how it operates, you know? That there is this, you know, there's not a denial of the material world. There's a participation in it and a spreading of what they perceive to be the truth or the gospel or whatever they want. But I take your point. I take your point there, or points. You know, I just see it as every institution has that problem. So if every institution has that problem, then, you know, I don't know, it's either revert and not be part of anything and be your own, and then go and maybe make your own cult or your own religion, or do your own private practice or whatever you want to do, or try out something else, you know. But I see your point. I see the points there.
It may not be either or either.
Right.
A person can enter into, as you seem to have done, enter into an organization somewhat experimentally.
Yeah.
You're not actually selling your soul or signing a billion-year contract. Doesn't mean there aren't risks, of course. I mean, I even feel that risk with Dave Oshana. I have. I mean, even just giving any sort of authority to anyone or anything is a risk. Right. But trying to do it alone, of course, is another kind of risk.
That's a good point.
Right. So, I mean, I flirted with joining my local church. Not that I didn't flirt, because I never even found out which one I would join if I was going to join. But I entertained the idea that maybe I could go that route. And I'm not ruling out entirely. And if I did something like that, it would obviously, I think it's obvious, be contingent on the individuals who made up that group. Right? So, and then, you know, the dogma, well, that's just the Bible. Like, there's all kinds of interpretations of the Bible, but if you want to talk about dogma, that's just got to be the Bible itself, and then that is just between you and the text. Yeah, you can talk about it with a bunch of people, but seems to me the opportunity there is to discover souls that we already have a deep affinity with, we already share in an orientation towards, in this case, Christ, but I'd say truth, or even reality, a true soul deep orientation towards reality, which I happen to think is very rare in this world. I may be wrong, and I may be proved wrong, but currently I think it's a very, very small minority. So then the chances of finding people in any organization who are oriented that way are small. And you can say, well, the bigger the orientation, the more likely to find them. But it's actually the opposite, because, you know, they'll be more spread out. So yeah, my take, my approach is more like build my own cult, while making sure every step of the way that it doesn't actually become a cult, as in just find the people that I want to gather together with to share an experience of being here and deepen our experience together, and including talking about Christ and truth and all that, without it becoming concretized into anything that could be mistaken for an institution, or even a philosophy or anything like that. So yeah, I mean, you asked what my goal was. Well, I mean, this is it, like what we're doing today. I don't really see beyond this, except so far as it can start to spill out into individuals' lives in their towns and their communities, and just always be grounded in the chopping of the wood and the carrying of the water stuff of living, so that those two things can develop together, the deepening understanding or experience of life with just the ordinary living.
And I saw the sun go down outside of Arkansas. I saw the sun come up somewhere in Illinois. And in the darkness I tried myself to hate. But where were you? Oh, where were you? And where did the sun go? I am a creature, I am surviving. I want to be alone, but I want your body. So when you eat me, mother and baby, oh baby, mother me before you